How do we know that God exists?
Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Plank. I respond to various theological and ideological questions and claims from a rationalistic and naturalistic approach in an effort to give and explain the opposite viewpoint and help to balance the conversation. Today we're going to be hearing from Brother John Therese from the channel Franciscan Missionaries of the Eternal Word. Bit of a mouthful for a channel name. And it occurred to me as I was watching him that it's odd that officials with the Catholic Church are always given familial titles. You know, like priests are often considered fathers, and John here is called a brother. But considering the history of the Catholic Church, one would think that all church officials should be more thought of as the funny uncle that all kids know not to be left alone with. But anyway, Brother John here is going to be going over some ways that we can know that God exists. And this delves into a little nagging problem that I've had with the rhetoric that you hear from theists for a long time now, and that is the failure to understand the difference between know and believe. You don't know God exists. You believe that God exists. Now, certainly an entire video could be done diving into the minutiae of the differences between the two words and the various conceptions around them. And the two are certainly linked, with knowledge being a subset of belief and all, but suffice it to say, beliefs are those things that we personally understand to be true, but may not actually be true. Whereas knowledge is defined as the small fraction of our beliefs that actually meet the scientific standard of evidence. Now, you may claim to know that your God exists, but there's plenty of other people who claim to know that their God exists, or that multiple gods exist, which themselves would preclude the possibility of your God existing, since the God concepts are mutually exclusive. And no God claim of any kind meets even the flimsiest scientific standard of evidence. So you cannot say that you know it in any way beyond the insistence of the self-assured opinion peddler who cannot differentiate between what they want to be true and what they can actually justify as true. But that being said, let's not put the cart too far before the horse and shout down Brother John before he's had a chance to state his case. And let's give him the floor for a bit and hear out his case for knowledge of God. But before we get to that, if you end up liking what you see in this video and would like to help out the channel, make sure to subscribe and click the bell so you'll always be notified when new content comes out. Check out my social media, including my Patreon and Twitter, all linked in the description. And of course, like this video, pop in a comment. All that goes a long way towards pleasing the YouTube algorithm, that eloquent elucidator of enmity towards ecclesiastical idiots expanding their ecumenical efforts and evangelism. May it keep my channel motoring along. Now on to today's video.
This can be a puzzling question, but one way is through the natural light of reason. In fact, the First Vatican Council 150 years ago declared that God, the beginning and first of all things, can be known by the means of the natural light of reason.
I'm not butting in to cut him off in the middle of making his case. That was literally his entire first point. After that 15 seconds, he goes off onto a different point altogether. He doesn't even attempt to explain or substantiate what he just said there. Just that, hey, humans can reason, therefore God. Well, hey, John, humans can reason, therefore brain. Brain does the reasoning. Brain became capable of doing the reasoning, come from evolution. And if you don't feel the need to explain your reason, therefore God claim in any way, then I don't think I need to explain my reason, therefore brain either. And as far as the First Vatican Council coming together and saying that God is the reason that man can reason, well, wait, you mean to tell me that a group of people heavily invested in the furtherance of the idea of a God, and especially in the furtherance of the Catholic Church, decided that there was good reason to believe in God, and specifically in the God that the Catholic Church pushes?
The hell you say?
Another way, and actually the way we can understand what he means by, or the Council means by created things, is that taking the whole of nature, contemplating nature, and that includes the human soul, with our powers of intellect and will.
And the unproven assumption of the existence of the human soul is a part of nature. Nature being all the world around us that we can take in and contemplate and explore and, that we can know empirically exists. But that apparently also includes the undetectable, unexplorable, unmeasurable, ethereal, intangible ghost battery that operates our skin sacks like a translucent Power Ranger driving a meat Megazord.
All right, let's get him. Right. Mega Dragon Sword, power up!
Call me crazy, but I think you might need to actually prove the existence of such a supernatural aspect of the human condition that you call a soul before you can attempt to use that as proof of, or a way of knowing the existence of, the supernatural God being. You can't just throw out, soul means God, John. Because if you do, then forget trying to prove God and just prove a soul. Can't do that? Then you'll forgive me if I consider that argument as baloney.
Our knowledge is real, but it's indirect. And so a way we can understand this is that simply by, for example, there was an old man who lived out in the desert, and someone once asked him, how do you know that God exists? And the way he responded was by the same way that I know when I see footprints in the sand, that I know that a man or an animal has walked this way. And that knowledge is actually based on an inference. And that's how we come to know God's existence through the natural means.
Okay, footprints in the sand just seems like a lazier, less refined version of the watchmaker argument. The idea being that a watch doesn't just form by itself, something had to have made it intentionally. And, like that, footprints don't just form by themselves, some being must have walked there in order to make them. And of course, this suffers from the same problem that the watchmaker argument does. That being the weak analogy fallacy, which is when an analogy is used to prove or disprove an argument, but the analogy is too dissimilar to be effective. That is, it is unlike the argument more than it is like the argument. The universe is not footprints in the sand. The universe is not a watch. The universe is not something that is in any way analogous to anything made by a living being. Looking at the world around us, nature or the universe, everything that we can perceive, and seeing it as designed or made with intentionality is like looking at a mountain and wondering who stacked rocks so high. Or, not to steal Douglas Adams' thunder, but rather like looking at a puddle and assuming that someone must have dug a hole for it. All footprints on a beach tells you for sure is that something vaguely the size and shape of a foot was pressed into the sand with enough force to make an inch or so depression, and that this was done over and over again in succession in a row that runs the length of the beach. And when you consider all of the possible candidate explanations for such a thing, you might think of things like, say, a boulder with a bunch of foot-shaped outgrowths and it was rolling down the beach. Or several foot-shaped hailstones falling in pretty much a straight line and then melting away, but leaving the divots that they made. Or a person or animal walking along the beach. Now, it doesn't take much contemplation to realize that the candidate explanation that makes the most sense is the person or animal making the footprints. But now, what are the candidate explanations for how a universe rife with galaxies, stars, and planets formed? Well, completely naturally, devoid of any intellect or intentionality, is certainly one of those candidate explanations. Because we know how stars form, and it seems to be entirely naturally. We know how galaxies form, and it seems to be entirely naturally. We know how planets form, and it seems to be entirely naturally. In fact, we have no example of any kind of celestial body forming in any way other than naturally. So, comes right down to it, naturally is the only viable candidate explanation for how the natural world around us formed. You can't even say your God counts as a possible candidate explanation because you have no logical reason to appeal to such a being beyond a persistent God of the gaps argument. From the days when we didn't have the first clue about how anything in the universe formed, and so we made up the supernatural notion that a God being did it all through magic. And now that we know better than that, people like you and other theists continue to obstinately cling to the idea of a God claim absent of any viable reason to do so. In short, no, the natural world is nothing like a footprint, and you cannot infer intentional design from the existence of the natural world.
So our universe is like a grand cathedral. It's vast, it's majestic, but there's kind of a strange beauty about it too. In fact, in the 19th century, there was a real prominent scientist by the name of Émile de Bois-Reymond, and he noticed that there were 7 mysteries about the universe. That if we just take matter as our God, and that's the belief that matter is all there is. That's what they call materialism.
Another rhetorical device that annoys me, much like the conflation of knowledge and belief, is the way theists like to play fast and loose with the definition of God, such that they like to claim that everyone has a God. Oh, for greedy people, money is their God. Or for drunkards, booze is their God. Atheists often think of themselves as their own God. Or, in this case, with Brother John's claim, materialists think of matter as God. It's strange that people who put the notion of God in such high esteem are so willing to water down the term to the point of basically thinking that anything that someone cares about has become their God. Look, I like cheesecake, but cheesecake is not my God, even though I hold cheesecake in significantly higher esteem than the Christian God concept. No, God actually means something. Even taking out all of the supernatural aspects of the term, the omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent sorts of things, at the very least, at the absolute minimum, God has to at least meet the criteria of being worshipped and viewed with great reverence. Materialists do not worship matter. Materialism may be the notion that the material universe is all that there is, but acknowledging something as being the totality of existence does not entail any kind of worship or fealty towards that material universe. Now, why do theists often do this? Conflation of things that non-believers care about with God? Well, it's because they themselves have God as the ultimate most important thing in existence. And they can't wrap their minds around non-believers not doing the same thing, just with something else in the place of God. Well, sorry, John, but people who don't believe in God don't just substitute something else in the God hole in their psyche. We don't have a God hole at all.
But with that, our universe is unreasonable. In fact, he proposed these questions, namely, what is the nature of matter and force?
What is the nature of matter and force? Well, matter is the interaction and bonding between atoms that come in 4 forms: solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. Based on a number of features, but largely based on how much heat or energy the atoms contain, affects what form that the matter takes. And as for what is the nature of force...
The force is what gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together.
But seriously, force is defined as a push or pull upon an object resulting from the object's interaction with another object. Whenever there is an interaction between 2 objects, there is force upon each of the objects. When the interaction ceases, the 2 objects no longer experience the force. Forces only exist as a result of an interaction. Now, this was basically a loaded question from the start, because to fully explore and delve into the specifics of matter and force would require a hell of a lot longer than can be addressed in a simple YouTube video. I mean, there's this entire branch of science that has been studying and advancing our knowledge in all of these areas for generations now. You may have actually heard of it before. It's called physics. And yeah, we've learned a hell of a lot about the exact nature of matter and force. Certainly more than Émile de Bois-Reymond could have imagined.
Where does motion come from?
Motion comes from force, so this is really just an extension of the previous question.
Where does life originate?
So this is actually an interesting question, considering the analogy you made a bit earlier about the footprints on the beach. As you said then, this is knowledge that a person comes to through inference. Well, the same is true about the origin of life. Since we don't have a time machine to hop back in to observe it as it actually happened, all we have is the evidence left over about where life came from in order to draw inferences from. And all the information and evidence that we have available to us has made the most prominent and widely accepted notion of how life originated to be abiogenesis. Simple organic molecules, similar to the nucleotide shown below, are the building blocks of life and must have been involved in its origin. Experiments suggest that organic molecules could have been synthesized in the atmosphere of early Earth and rained down into the oceans. RNA and DNA molecules, the genetic material for all life, are just long chains of simple nucleotides. From there, replicating molecules evolved and began to undergo natural selection. Replicating molecules became enclosed within a cell membrane. Some cells began to evolve modern metabolic processes and outcompete those with older forms of metabolism. And then multicellularity evolved. Now, even if you want to claim that we cannot confirm that this is what actually happened to form the earliest life, it is certainly one of the most likely candidate explanations. And if the strongest competition abiogenesis has in terms of candidate explanations is the idea of a supernatural being casting a golem spell on some dirt in order to create man out of it, and then he took a rib from that man and grew it into a woman, while simultaneously regrowing that rib in the man so that there was no trace of the rib stealing in the first place, which is overall an idea which is entirely superfluous to begin with, considering the supposed ability of that god being able to create things from nothing. Giving rise to the question, well then why did he need to take a rib from the guy in the first place? If this is the only other candidate explanation, or something similar and equally nonsensical from some other theology, well then abiogenesis and the idea of life arising naturally and without intentionality is standing on pretty solid footing, I would say.
What causes sensation in consciousness?
Sensation is caused by electrical impulses transmitted via the nervous system. Consciousness is an emergent property of the brain, both of which are the product of evolution developing those traits and natural selection selecting for the success of creatures with such abilities. It's easy to see how a creature able to sense damage and injury that it's sustaining would be more successful at survival than a creature insensate to such pain. If your hand is too near a fire and you feel it start to burn, you pull it away. Any such efforts to avoid injury or promote personal health and well-being would result in a longer-lived, less injured, less impaired creature, and ultimately more successful at survival. And then a creature capable of cognition and information processing is going to be better able to solve problems, understand reasons why things are the way they are, and thereby be more effective at navigating the world it's in and manipulating that world for its own betterment. Also, clearly a survival and thriving advantage. So, both sensation and cognition perfectly explainable through evolution.
Where does rational thought and speech come from?
Now you're speaking my language.
As many of you know, I'm a professor of communication studies, and how and why we develop the methods of communication that we have is kind of my bread and butter. The where did human thought come from part of the question seems to be just an extension of the previous question. Our ability to process information, or what we call rational thought, is an outgrowth of our cognitive complexity, which developed through evolution and natural selection. Language, on the other hand, is a behavior, and as such, it's not technically the result of evolution. At least, not biological evolution. Evolutionary psychology, definitely, though. See, we needed to be able to share our thoughts with others in order to coordinate our efforts and cooperate properly, as we're a very cooperative species. Every cooperative species, in fact, develops ways to communicate among themselves in order to coordinate their efforts. Ants developed chemical emissions that send information to one another that allow the other ants to follow and find the food source that the first ant discovered. Bees communicate by body language and intricate dances that inform the others from their hive what they want them to know. Dogs howl, chameleons change color, birds sing. Communication between creatures is about as common as it gets. Some more complex and capable of exchanging more information than others. We humans develop the most complex of them all. We develop various systems of symbolic cues, which are symbols, either written or spoken, that stand in for the actual thing that they symbolize. The word chair, either written or spoken, is a symbolic cue that stands in for an actual chair. And we develop ways of expressing those symbolic cues to others in order to convey information to others. The fact that it's grown in complexity to the point of being able to convey massive amounts of information is a testament to our cognitive complexity, true enough, but it is perfectly natural and very much in line with what practically all other animals do to one degree or another. The fact that we do it better and more skillfully than any other creature on the planet is not indicative of the divine.
Why do we see order in the universe?
You know, there are several phrases that I found myself repeating over and over in response videos like this to theists who keep making the same bull-headed exclamations based largely on ignorance and intellectual dishonesty. One is when they constantly misunderstand the Big Bang, and I've very often repeated, the Big Bang was not the explosion of the universe out of nothing, it is the expansion of the current presentation of our universe from an initial state of high density and temperature. Well, I have another statement that I have to keep repeating whenever a theist throws out some version of the teleological argument, as Brother John just did, or also known as the argument from design or order. They'll regularly ask things like Brother John just did, why do we see such order in the world around us? And I will regularly have to retort, ahem, both order and disorder are natural states of the universe. The fact that we seem to exist in an area of the universe where there is more order than disorder is not indicative of a god. There are plenty of places in the universe where disorder is in effect. Areas where no celestial bodies can form, like the area around a black hole where all matter, energy, and even light will be pulled in and compacted. But when we tend to think in terms of order and often consider order as a default state, it's because our little corner of the cosmos seems fairly ordered in comparison to places like black hole cosmic neighborhoods. But saying that because our location is ordered means that everywhere must be similarly ordered is like someone who lives in a desert thinking that the whole world must be covered in sand. It's having a prejudice for order. Also, another wrinkle, areas of order tend to hang around for longer. Order tends to be more stable than disorder, but that doesn't mean that disorder isn't a thing. Take, for instance, the three-body problem. A simple setup of three different bodies interacting with each other, each with all the same properties, masses, starting distances, etc. The longer the interaction goes on, the less possible it is to predict their movements and interactions. The more chaotic their movements seem to become, until they collide or fly off somewhere else altogether. And the more complex a system becomes, the more disorder, or at least the more potential for disorder, arises. So order in places like the world we see around us, and disorder in places like we see out in the rest of the universe, are both natural states. Both order and disorder are natural ways of being, neither indicative of the divine.
What is free will?
Free will. Well, that's a philosophical question, and it's one that's been kicked around for generations, and philosophers don't really seem to be any closer to locking it down than they've ever been. But that problem of not being able to come to a conclusion seems mostly to be a problem of definition, and therefore a problem with how we think of free will or talk about free will, than it is a problem with free will itself. Often you'll hear people talk about what they call libertarian free will. With this notion of free will, it requires a gap in universal causality. The self initiates actions, but when acting freely, is not itself caused to do so. Human decision-making thus occupies a special place outside of the natural order. So this view of free will requires that nothing, absolutely nothing whatsoever, can have an influence on a person's decision-making in order for it to be a truly free will decision. So that means that if you, say, haven't had anything to drink all day, and you go grab a bottle of water from the fridge and down half of it, that wasn't a free will choice. Your biological need to hydrate motivated your actions, and thus was not true free will. Because of this, and because of the influences of a wide variety of factors on each and every decision we ever make in our lives, many people who hold to the idea of libertarian free will propose that free will is a myth and can't possibly exist. There's simply too many influences on every decision we ever make in order for any of them to be truly free. Now, personally, I don't define free will in the libertarian terms. I view free will as the ability to make whatever decisions one chooses based on whatever criteria, motivation, and influences that they like, provided that those choices are free of the coercion or domination of another thinking agent. Now, this notion of free will would mean that, under the Christian conception of God and humanity, free will doesn't exist. And frankly, any definition of free will that I'm familiar with seems impossible in the Christian model. According to Christianity, God is all-knowing, including perfect, infallible knowledge of the future. That God knows everything that you will do throughout the entire course of your life with 100% accuracy. This would mean that everything is predetermined, and that no person has the ability to choose anything that God has not foreseen. As such, no human can possibly have free will, but only the illusion of it. No more free to choose than a quarterback in a videotaped football game is free to choose anything different than the quarterback did when the game was live. So, while I believe in free will, if I were to regress and become a Christian again, I would have to stop believing in free will because an all-knowing God cannot coexist with actual, true free will.
Now, we've grown a lot in our knowledge in these areas, but they still remain a mystery. In fact, in some cases, there's been even more mystery opened up about what we don't know based on what we do know.
This just seems like an advertisement for God of the Gaps. But I wouldn't even say it's true that there's more mystery in any of these areas now than there was back when we were just starting out examining these fields of study. It's not that what is unknown has grown, it's just our awareness of what we don't know has grown. For instance, say an ancient culture who thought the world was all that existed, and that the stars were just lights in the sky, the sun and the moon bigger lights in the sky, but that the earth in the sky was all that there was. Say they then learned that there are other planets and lots of space and other galaxies, and that everything was much bigger than they ever imagined. Well, the amount that was unknown to them hasn't increased. It's actually decreased. It's just that they're now more aware of just how much they didn't know. The same is true with us. Every mystery we solve may open several new mysteries that we weren't even contemplating before, but that doesn't change the fact that we know more now than we did yesterday. That the gaps in our knowledge are still shrinking. And that the old arguments that have been used by theists like yourself for centuries are still failing more and more every day, and every day proving less and less capable of holding water. Which is why you, Brother John, cling to questions like those that you gave when they came from antiquity, and act like they're as relevant today as they were when they were first made. But we understand matters like evolution, neurology, psychology, physics, and the overall nature of the universe with immensely more precision and clarity than when people like the aforementioned Émile de Bois-Reymond were around. So to repeat the same questions that they asked and act like they're still as up in the air is not only to languish in your own ignorance, but to push for other people to languish in ignorance as well. And why? Well, because it's difficult to push a religion that every day becomes less and less compatible with what we've come to understand about the world around us on people who have a working knowledge of that world and how it works. And to be clear, I'm not saying that no religion is compatible with science. But, Look at the willful ignorance of young earth creationists and flat earthers and tell me you aren't committing the same errors in reasoning when you say that we don't know where consciousness comes from or how language developed.
So I conclude with this quote by St. Augustine, taken from the Catechism, and he says that question the beauty of the earth, question the beauty of the sea, question the beauty of the air distancing and diffusing itself, question the beauty of the sky. Question all these realities. All respond, see, we are beautiful. Their beauty is a confession. These beauties are subject to change. Who made them, if not the beautiful one, who's not subject to change?
And I'll retort with Douglas Adams himself.
And it's rather like a puddle waking up one morning. I know they don't normally do this, but allow me, I'm a science fiction writer. A puddle wakes up one morning and thinks, this is a very interesting world I find myself in. It fits me very neatly. In fact, it fits me so neatly, I mean, really precise, isn't it? It must have been made to have me in it.
I propose that what you and Augustine are marveling at as beauty that you believe can only be the result of the guiding hand of a creator God is actually the natural existence of the world around us formed through natural processes. And that we, not just humanity, but all life, evolved within and from that natural world. But because we grew in and of this world, it seems to fit us. It seems to appeal to our aesthetic sensibilities. It appears as beautiful to us. Not because it was made for us to be appealing to an aesthetic criteria that was already set, but instead, our concept of beauty was shaped by this world that we came from. A world that doesn't actually fit us, but instead a world that we fit. A world that is not beautiful, but a world that we find to be so. And that's where Brother John concludes. So, this entire attempt to validate the idea of knowing that God exists was fraught with problems. A hefty amount of those problems were just misunderstandings of what humans know and basic willful ignorance. At multiple points in his video, he kept calling back to centuries-old figures and citing them and their musings. Either Émile de Bois-Reymond, or St. Augustine, or the Vatican Council. And these might be fine to cite if you're talking about the history of religion or philosophy, but when you're predicating your argument on questions that are firmly in the realm of science, like where did life come from, and what's the nature of matter and energy or forces, if you can't cite anyone from the last, say, 100 years at least in your argument, but then proceed to insist that we know even less today than we did back in the good old days, well, you aren't being intellectually honest. You aren't talking from a good faith position. So where's this guy talking from instead?
He bends over and he speaks from his rear.
In the end, if your attempt to establish your basis for knowing God exists relies on a colossal argument from ignorance, while sprinkling in an implied argument from incredulity fallacy, then you not only don't have a solid argument for knowing God exists, I would say you don't even have a valid rationale for believing that God exists. Seriously, just say that you want God to be real and that's all that you need to be convinced of it. At least that would be a more intellectually honest position to take, if not an argumentatively indefensible one. And so that is where we'll end things for today. So, thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like this video, comment, and subscribe so you'll always be notified when a new video comes out. Check me out on Twitter and Patreon if you'd like to support my work directly. My Teespring if you want some Plinky merchandise. All that link below in the description. Until next time, I'm Professor Plink reminding you to keep striving for greater understanding. It's the best way to get wherever you want to go.